They crossed the line. The Royal Guard's discipline is unbreakable. It was a bright afternoon in London, and the square in front of Buckingham Palace was bustling with tourists. People from all over the world gathered, cameras in hand, eagerly waiting for a chance to witness the famous changing of the guard or to simply admire the Royal Guards, standing tall and motionless in their red uniforms and bearskin hats. Among the respectful visitors, however, was a group of 3 young men in their early 20s who had different intentions. Dressed in casual hoodies, sneakers, and ripped jeans, they weren't here to admire history or tradition. They were here to cause trouble. "Mate, look at this guy," one of them, Liam, scoffed as he pointed at one of the Royal Guards standing near the gates. "He hasn't even blinked." His friend, Jake, smirked, crossing his arms. "What do you reckon? Think we can make him laugh?" The third, Owen, pulled out his phone and grinned. "Nah, let's see if we can make him move. Imagine the views we'd get on TikTok." The 3 snickered, completely unaware of the disapproving glances they were receiving from other tourists. To them, this was just another social media challenge, a fun prank to show off to their followers. Liam took the lead, stepping forward and standing directly in front of the Royal Guard. With a mockingly serious face, he straightened his back, puffed out his chest, and mimicked the soldier's rigid stance. Jake and Owen burst into laughter, pointing at him like this was the funniest thing they had ever seen. A few tourists near them frowned, shaking their heads. One woman whispered, "That's just disrespectful." A father, holding his young son's hand, sighed and muttered, "They have no idea what the uniform stands for." But the young men didn't care. Liam, seeing that the Royal Guard hadn't reacted, decided to push it further. He waved his hands wildly in front of the guard's face, smirking as if he had just cracked the code to breaking their legendary discipline. "Come on, mate. Say something." Liam taunted. Owen, still filming, zoomed in on the soldier's face. "This is too easy," he laughed. "We'll have this guy moving in no time." But the Royal Guard didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, rifle in hand, gaze locked straight ahead. The crowd, however, was no longer amused. And as the young men prepared to take things even further, they failed to notice that their childish game was about to take a serious turn. Liam smirked as he stepped even closer to the Royal Guard, now just inches away from his face. Still, no reaction. The soldier remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands gripping the rifle with unwavering precision. But instead of backing off, Liam saw this as a challenge. "Oh, mate, you're good," he chuckled, glancing back at his friends. "But let's see if you can handle this." Jake and Owen snickered as Liam raised his arms, dramatically flailing them right in front of the soldier's face. Nothing. The crowd watched in tense silence, a mix of curiosity and growing unease. A group of older British tourists muttered among themselves, shaking their heads. They have no idea who they're messing with. But Liam wasn't done. He took things one step further, stepping directly into the guard's personal space. "Hello?" he shouted, waving his hand inches from the soldier's nose. "Earth to Buckingham, man. Anybody home?" Jake and Owen burst out laughing, doubling over as they watched. "This is gold," Owen grinned, still recording. "Dude, you have to do something crazier." Liam thought for a second, then grinned mischievously. Without warning, he leaned in even closer, so close he could practically feel the soldier's breath. Then, in an act of pure arrogance, he pretended to reach toward the guard's bearskin hat. The entire crowd gasped. A woman nearby covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh no! He's really gone too far." A British veteran, who had been watching the scene quietly, clenched his jaw. "This lad's about to learn a very hard lesson." Liam's fingers barely grazed the edge of the hat. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The moment Liam's fingers barely grazed the edge of the Royal Guard's hat, the entire crowd froze. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. For the first time since the group started their mockery, nervous whispers filled the air. Some tourists clutched their bags, others instinctively took a step back, as if anticipating something serious was about to happen. But despite the blatant disrespect, the Royal Guard didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even acknowledge Liam's disrespectful stunt. He simply stood his ground, rifle gripped tight, posture perfect, an immovable symbol of discipline, pride, and centuries-old tradition. Liam, expecting some kind of reaction, tilted his head in confusion. "Seriously? Nothing?" he scoffed, turning to his friends. "Dude, is this guy even human?" Jake and Owen laughed, but their laughter was starting to sound forced, as if they, too, were beginning to feel the shift in the atmosphere. The crowd was no longer entertained. An elderly woman near the front crossed her arms. "These young men have no idea how much training it takes to earn that uniform," she muttered. A father, holding his young daughter's hand, shook his head. "They think it's just for show," he said. "But they don't understand what the uniform stands for." Liam, still oblivious to the rising tension, smirked and turned back to the guard. "All right, mate," he sneered. "Let's see how much more you can take." He leaned in again, as if preparing to push his luck even further. But before he could act, something changed. Though the royal guard himself remained motionless, something in his presence shifted. A subtle tightening of his jaw. A slight adjustment of his stance. It wasn't an emotional reaction, it was a signal. And suddenly, the people in the crowd who understood military discipline knew exactly what was about to happen. One of them, a British veteran watching from the sidelines, smirked slightly and muttered under his breath, "It's over for him." And then, it happened. The shift in atmosphere was almost tangible. The royal guard, though still completely motionless, radiated authority in a way that Liam had failed to recognize before. The grip on his rifle remained firm, his gaze locked forward, but something in his presence had changed. It wasn't just discipline anymore, it was a warning. The crowd, once murmuring in amusement, had fallen completely silent. Jake and Owen finally sensed it, their previous laughter dying down. But Liam was still too arrogant to realize. Just as he prepared to mock the soldier again, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Step away from the guard. Now." The command was so powerful that Liam's body instinctively jerked back before he even knew what was happening. The crowd turned toward the voice, and there, emerging from the crowd with military precision, was a high-ranking British officer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence alone demanded respect. His piercing gaze locked onto Liam, and for the first time since this whole prank had started, the cocky young man looked genuinely unsure of himself. "Sir," the officer said, his tone clipped and professional. "You are interfering with an active-duty soldier. Step back immediately." Liam blinked, his bravado starting to crack. "I was just..." "Now." The officer didn't raise his voice, but the sheer authority in his tone made it clear that there was no room for discussion. Jake and Owen backed away instantly, their faces pale. Liam, suddenly very aware that all eyes were on him, swallowed hard. The tourists, who had been mere onlookers a moment ago, were now watching intently, waiting to see how this would end. A mother in the crowd whispered to her son, "This is what happens when you disrespect the royal guard." Liam hesitated, still trying to hold on to some shred of arrogance, but the weight of the officer's stare was crushing. Then, before he could open his mouth again, a new voice joined the conversation, one that immediately commanded even more respect than the officers. A British veteran, gray-haired, standing with perfect military posture, stepped forward from the crowd. He fixed his steely gaze on Liam and said, "Son, do you even understand what you're mocking?" The crowd's attention immediately shifted as the elderly British veteran stepped forward. He was in his late 60s, dressed smartly in a navy blazer adorned with several military medals, a symbol of a life dedicated to service. His presence commanded instant respect, even the officer standing nearby gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. But his steely gaze was locked onto Liam. The young man, who just moments ago had been full of cocky arrogance, now stood frozen. "Do you even understand what you're mocking, son?" the veteran asked, his voice firm but controlled. Liam opened his mouth, but no words came out. The older man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Liam's. "That uniform," he continued, nodding toward the royal guard, "isn't just for show. That young man standing there, He's not a statue. He's a soldier. A soldier who has trained harder than you could imagine. A soldier who has sworn an oath to protect this country and its people, no matter the cost. Liam shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "You think this is funny?" the veteran asked, his voice growing sharper. "Do you know how many men have worn that uniform before him? Men who stood in this very spot, some of whom later fought and died for their country?" The crowd remained completely silent, hanging on to his every word. Jake and Owen lowered their heads, looking genuinely ashamed. Even the officer who had first intervened remained quiet, allowing the veteran to speak. "I served with men like him," the old soldier continued, his expression hardening. "Men who didn't just stand still, but who fought in the Falklands, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Men who stood shoulder to shoulder with American, Australian, and Canadian troops. Men who didn't hesitate when their country needed them." Liam couldn't meet his eyes anymore. "You stand here, laughing, pointing, waving your hands like a fool, because you think it's funny that he won't move?" The veteran shook his head. "He won't move because he has something you don't: discipline, honor, respect." A murmur spread through the crowd. A few people nodded in agreement. Others simply watched in awe, realizing they had just witnessed something far more powerful than they expected. Liam's face flushed red. His hands twitched at his sides, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but there was nothing he could say. For the first time, he understood. The veteran took a step back, giving Liam one last piercing look. Then, in a final act of respect, he turned toward the Royal Guard, still standing as rigid as ever, and gave him a slow, solemn salute. Liam swallowed hard, his arrogance now completely shattered. He turned to his friends, mumbling under his breath, "Let's get out of here." And as they walked away, heads lowered in shame, the crowd finally exhaled, breaking into quiet applause. The message had been received. This wasn't just a tourist attraction. This was tradition. Honor. Discipline. And it demanded respect.